When I returned to the house where I spent my childhood, I thought it would be temporary. A week, maybe 2, just enough to rest, heal, and disappear again into the noise of my old life. But the moment I stepped through the door, something shifted. Not in the walls or the scent of polished wood and faint cinnamon that always lingered, but in me. The quiet hit too hard. The light too soft. And he hadn't changed much. My stepfather stood in the hallway, holding my suitcase like it weighed more than it should. We exchanged a polite smile, and for a second, I almost forgot how to breathe. He looked at me with those familiar, steady eyes, the same ones that used to calm me when I was a scared little girl hiding under the covers during a thunderstorm. Only now, I wasn't a little girl. And he wasn't just my stepfather. I should have left then. I should have turned around and said, this was a mistake. But instead, I smiled back. That's how it started. Not with a kiss. Not with a touch. With silence. And the kind of memory that doesn't knock, it crashes. You may be wondering how I let things go so far. But before you judge, let me tell you what really happened. And before I share the secret I've kept buried for years, tell me in the comments, have you ever gone back somewhere, thinking you were safe, only to realize that nothing has really changed except you? The doctor said I needed rest. No more screens. No more late nights hunched over files. Just sun, quiet, and time. Time to let my body heal, but more than that, my nerves, too. After the accident at work, after the fall down the marble staircase that left me with a hairline fracture and a concussion, I thought I'd be grateful for the break. But I wasn't. I hated being idle. I hated how slow everything felt. Most of all, I hated the idea of going home. Still, I didn't have a choice. My mother offered, or rather insisted, that I recover at their country house. It was where I grew up. A house tucked away near a lake, with creaking wood and windows that caught the morning light like stained glass. I hadn't visited in years. Not since my college graduation. And even then, it was only for a few hours before I made up an excuse and disappeared. She greeted me with her usual clipped efficiency, kiss on the cheek, questions about prescriptions and physical therapy, a tight hug that didn't linger. Within 15 minutes, she'd already reminded me that she had commitments in the city and would be leaving the next morning. You'll be in good hands, she said. He's always been good at taking care of things. She meant her husband. My stepfather. We weren't close, not really. But we had our moments. I remembered the warmth of his presence during storms, how he'd sit by my bed with a book and a flashlight, keeping me calm while the thunder raged. It wasn't much, but it was something. He met me at the driveway, took my suitcase, and gave me a nod, not warm, not cold. Just steady. That was always his way. Not many words, not much emotion, but a calmness that felt reliable in a world that wasn't. The guest room was smaller than I remembered. Dusty bookshelves, an old rocking chair, a framed photo of me at 10, missing 2 teeth. The sheets smelled like lavender and the window overlooked the woods. I could already feel the quiet beginning to press in. That night, after my mother left, the silence was even heavier. No city traffic, no neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls. Just crickets and the occasional distant bark from the neighbor's dog. I couldn't sleep. My leg throbbed slightly, more from memory than pain. I tossed and turned, until I gave up entirely and got out of bed. The hallway was dim, the lights switched off. I limped quietly, barefoot, letting my hand trail the wooden railing of the staircase. I passed the old reading room, its door slightly ajar. He was in there. Sitting in the same armchair he always sat in, legs crossed, a cup of tea in one hand and a book in the other. He didn't look up right away. I couldn't sleep, I said, finally. He looked up, nodded once, then gestured to the chair across from him. I hesitated, then sat. For a few minutes, we said nothing. The fire crackled gently in the old stone hearth. It smelled like pine and smoke, the kind of scent that sits in your skin for hours. He turned a page. You used to come down here when it stormed, he said, not looking at me. I remember. You were terrified of thunder. I smiled faintly. Still am. He set his book down, finally met my eyes. You don't have to be. Not here. The way he said it, calm, certain, it made something tighten in my chest. I looked away, down at my hands. My fingers curled into the blanket draped across my legs. I didn't know what to say. So I didn't say anything. The lights flickered, and then the room went dark. The suddenness of it made me jolt slightly. He stood immediately, walked across the room, and opened the drawer where I remembered he kept emergency candles. Power goes out more often than it used to, he said. He lit a candle, its flame casting soft shadows across his face. I watched him, how sure his movements were, how unfazed. He handed me one of the candles and our fingers brushed, just slightly. The heat from the wick wasn't the only thing that made me feel warm. We sat there a while longer. I watched the candlelight dance in the reflection of the window. The wind had picked up outside. I thought I heard distant thunder, but maybe that was my own heartbeat, steady and nervous in my ears. Do you remember that storm when I was 8? I asked. He nodded. You ran into the kitchen crying. Your mom told you to calm down, but you wouldn't. I carried you to your room. And stayed with me. I read you that book about the fox and the lighthouse. My voice caught slightly. That's the last time I remember feeling completely safe. He didn't respond. Not for a long moment. Then, some things change. Some things don't. I don't know how long we sat there in silence. But when I finally stood to return to my room, he followed me with his eyes. Not inappropriately. Just watching. Like he didn't quite trust what might happen next. Neither did I. As I lay in bed later that night, candles still flickering on the windowsill, I wondered why I felt more exposed now than I had when I first walked through the door. Maybe it wasn't the injury. Maybe it wasn't even him. Maybe it was the house. Because somehow, that quiet old place had a way of bringing everything back. The warmth. The fear. The longing. And maybe, just maybe, something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. But I would. Soon. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The candle on my windowsill had burned down completely, leaving behind a small pool of wax and a charred wick. The room was cold. Not from the weather, it was early spring, but the walls of this house held on to chill like secrets. I stretched carefully, my legs still stiff but no longer painful, and pulled on a thick cardigan over my pajamas. I didn't bother with socks or brushing my hair. Something felt unfinished from last night, and I needed to feel it out in the silence. Downstairs, the kitchen was already lit with that soft amber hue of old light bulbs. He was there. At the counter. Pouring water into the kettle. I paused in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or even how to act. I didn't feel guilty, not yet, but something about the way he looked up at me made the air shift again. We didn't say much over breakfast. I made toast. He handed me jam. It was all mechanical, quiet, strangely intimate in its ordinariness. I caught myself watching the way he stirred his tea, slow, methodical, like everything he did. Nothing rushed. No wasted motion. At some point, I asked if he'd like to walk the garden with me later. I wasn't sure why I offered. Maybe because I remembered how peaceful it used to be, with the lilacs and the old swing and the bench near the shed. Or maybe because I wanted to test how far this thing between us would stretch before it broke. He said yes without looking up. The garden had changed little since I was a girl. A few more weeds, a few fewer flowers. The swing creaked when the wind hit it just right. We walked slowly, mostly in silence, and I used his arm for balance, my hand resting on the crook of his elbow. It was practical. Necessary, even. But I felt every inch of that contact like it burned. I kept noticing little things. The way his beard had gone silver near his chin. The soft fold in his shirt where it always tucked into his belt. The small scar on his wrist that I had never asked about. He commented on how tall the hedges had grown, how my mother wanted them trimmed but always forgot. I nodded. We moved slowly along the path, neither of us in a hurry to finish the loop. It felt like we were circling something we didn't want to name. That afternoon, the clouds rolled in. Not storm clouds, not yet, but enough to dim the light in the house and make it feel like evening by 4 o'clock. I stayed in the guest room for a while, flipping through an old photo album I found on the shelf behind the dresser. Most of the pictures were from summers at the lake. Birthdays. A few blurry Christmases. And there, in one corner, a candid photo of him sitting on the floor, a book in his lap, me leaning against his shoulder, clearly mid-laugh. The photo made my throat tighten. I remembered that day. It had been raining. My mother had been upstairs on the phone for hours, and he had stayed with me, reading silly stories and making up different voices for each character. It wasn't the story I remembered, but the feeling. The safety. The attention. Later, I passed by the hallway mirror and barely recognized myself. Not physically, I looked like me. Just altered. Softer somehow. Like the edges I built in the city didn't quite survive here. I touched my reflection's cheek as if that would confirm something. Dinner was simple, pasta with leftover sauce. We sat at the table across from each other. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what would be safe. What could be said without shifting the fragile balance we had? I asked if he still read at night. He said yes, but not as often. His eyes weren't what they used to be. I offered to read to him. It came out before I could think it through. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If you'd like," he said. So that night, I found myself in the reading room, the same one from last night, sitting in the armchair he usually claimed. He sat opposite, legs crossed, sipping tea. I chose a book from the shelf behind me, a collection of essays about time and memory. Something dense enough to distract. My voice faltered at first, but then it settled. The words filled the room like warmth. I read for nearly an hour. He listened, still and attentive. At one point, I looked up and saw that he wasn't watching the pages. He was watching me. I kept reading. When I finally stopped, he exhaled like someone waking from a dream. I closed the book. Neither of us spoke. The air felt charged again. Not romantic. Not overt. Just full. We sat there like that for several minutes. Then he stood, stretched slightly, and said he'd head to bed. I nodded. He didn't move right away. He looked at me, like he wanted to say something and thought better of it. Then he turned and left. I stayed a while longer, staring into the fire until the flames dimmed to a dull red. Eventually, I made my way to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. When I looked up, he was standing in the doorway. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was suspended. Like we were on either side of a bridge, waiting for the other to take the first step. I opened my mouth, then closed it. He took one small step forward. I took one back. We stood like that for what felt like hours. Then I said, "It's late." He nodded. "Good night." "Good night." He turned and left. I stayed, listening to the sound of his steps on the stairs. That night, in bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't slow. I thought about the garden. About the way he looked at me while I read. About the picture of us in the photo album. I thought about the difference between missing something and needing it again. And I wondered how long we could pretend the line hadn't already been crossed. I woke to rain. Not a storm, not yet, but a steady tapping against the windows like something trying to remind me it was still there. The kind of rain that makes everything gray but gentle. I stayed in bed longer than I usually would. My body wasn't sore anymore, at least not physically. But something inside me had started to shift, like the way ground softens just before it gives way. When I finally got up, I moved slower. Deliberately. I wasn't in a rush to see him, but I wasn't avoiding him either. I needed to understand what this quiet thing between us meant, if it meant anything at all. Or if I was the only one who felt it. I found an old sweater of mine folded neatly in the wardrobe. I hadn't remembered leaving it there, but the soft threadbare feel of it brought back memories, summers by the lake, winters by the fire, laughter that was real, even if it was rare. I put it on and felt smaller somehow. Like I could slip back into a version of myself that didn't overthink everything. Downstairs, the house was nearly silent. I walked past the kitchen but didn't see him. A half-filled mug of coffee sat cooling on the counter. I traced the rim with my finger, uncertain. Then I saw movement outside. He was in the garden, in his coat, trimming back the overgrowth near the lilacs. The rain misted lightly over him, catching on the shoulders of his jacket and in his hair. I watched him from the window for a while, unnoticed. There was something comforting about the simplicity of it, the way he moved with purpose, unaffected by the damp. Grounded. I realized how rare that was in my life. How many people I knew who moved constantly without ever really being present. Eventually I went out to him, an umbrella in hand though I barely used it. He looked up when he saw me but didn't speak. I offered to help. He shook his head with a small smile and said it wasn't necessary. But I stayed anyway, kneeling in the wet earth beside him, brushing away leaves, pulling at weeds. We worked like that for a while, the only sounds the rain and our movements. When we went back inside, we both hung our coats by the door, draped damp towels over the radiator. The house smelled like rain and earth and wood. I made tea. He poured honey into mine without asking, he remembered. We sat in the living room, the fire from last night long gone, but its scent lingering in the walls. I opened one of the old family albums again. Not the one I'd looked through the day before, but another. Thicker. Less curated. Inside were photos I hadn't seen in years. Not staged holiday smiles, but candid moments. One of me curled up on the couch, asleep with a book open on my chest. Another of him, covered in flour, grinning awkwardly at the camera while baking. A third, the two of us at the lake, me sitting in a kayak, him steadying it from the dock, his hand on my shoulder. I stared at that last one longer than I should have. I remembered that day. I'd been scared to go out alone. My mother had said she didn't have time, and he had offered instead. I'd been 12. He'd steadied the boat the entire time, even when I insisted I was fine. Just in case. I closed the album quietly. Later, I wandered through the hallway upstairs. The doors were mostly shut. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I opened the linen closet, looking for extra sheets, and found a small box tucked behind the towels. Inside were old drawings, papers I recognized from when I was a child. One was a messy crayon sketch, a house, a girl with long brown hair, and a taller figure beside her. I'd written our names on top. It surprised me that he'd kept it. Downstairs again, I found him in the kitchen, scrubbing at something on the counter. His sleeves were rolled up, hands moving in slow circles. There was a strange calm between us. Not absence, but anticipation. He asked if I wanted to go into town the next day. Just for a drive. He said I'd probably enjoy the change of scenery. I agreed without thinking too much about it. A trip would mean time. A drive meant silence. The kind where things rise to the surface whether you want them to or not. That night, after dinner, I sat in the reading room again. I didn't take a book. I just sat there, trying to understand the weight that had started to build in me. A kind of pressure I couldn't define. He came in, glanced at the empty fireplace, and asked if I wanted one started. I nodded. We didn't speak much after that. The crackle of the fire was enough. Eventually, he handed me a blanket, the same one from the other night, and sat across from me with his tea. And then he said something I didn't expect. You always looked for the light, even when it wasn't there. It was so quiet, I almost thought I misheard. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know how. But something in me clenched, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming need to say the thing I'd been thinking since I arrived. I came back because I didn't know where else to go, I said. He nodded once, like he understood more than I meant to say. The fire burned lower. My eyes felt heavy. I didn't want to leave the room. I didn't want the moment to end. But eventually I stood. As I passed him, I paused. Just for a second. And then we kissed. No more than that. Just a moment, a breath, a quiet crossing of some invisible line. It was gentle. Brief. But it changed something in the air. I didn't say goodnight this time. I walked to my room, closed the door softly behind me, and stood there with my hand on the knob, heart racing. Not from guilt. But from knowing that this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept reliving the moment on a loop, not because it was dramatic or explosive, but because it wasn't. It was quiet. So quiet that it felt more intimate than anything loud or messy ever could have been. A soft unfolding. A confession without words. A door opened and left ajar. The next morning, I lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. My fingers traced the edge of the blanket, and I found myself wondering if he was awake yet. If he was downstairs making tea. If he felt what I felt, this weightless tension pressing just beneath the surface of everything. When I finally got up and dressed, I moved slowly, choosing a worn blue shirt from the back of the closet. It used to be my favorite, loose in the sleeves, soft from too many washes. It didn't match anything else I was wearing, but it felt right. Grounding. Honest. Downstairs, the kettle was already whistling. He stood at the stove, back to me, one hand resting lightly on the counter. The radio played low jazz, and the window behind him framed the lake beyond the trees like a painting. I didn't speak. I walked past him and reached for a mug. Our arms brushed, and neither of us pulled away. We sat at the table again, but it felt different. Not awkward, just fuller. Like the silence had meaning now. Like it held things instead of empty space. I drank my tea slowly, pretending to be distracted by the condensation on the window. But my mind was elsewhere. He mentioned the trip into town, reminding me of our plan from the day before. I said yes, perhaps too quickly. The idea of being somewhere else, even briefly, was comforting. A place without memories built into every corner. We left mid-morning. The drive was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that didn't ask for filling. I watched the trees blur past the window, each one a soft stroke of green and gray. The roads were familiar, but I hadn't been down them in years. Time had softened the landscape. Or maybe just my memory of it. In town, we didn't do much. Walked through the market. Stopped at the bakery. He pointed out the old hardware store that had closed, and I commented on the new cafe that had taken its place. It was mundane, and yet I found myself noticing everything: how he held the door for me, how he carried the bag of bread like it was instinct, how he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. We ate lunch at a small diner near the edge of town. The kind with red booths and cracked menus, the smell of old oil and strong coffee in the air. He sat across from me, and I could feel the weight of his gaze, even when I kept my eyes on my plate. He didn't bring up the kiss. Neither did I. But it sat between us like a third person at the table. When we got back to the house, the sky had started to darken. The weather had been unpredictable all week, sun one moment, gray the next. I took that as a cue to change into something warmer. While I was upstairs, I passed by my mother's old sewing room. The door was ajar. Dust had gathered on the windowsill, and the air smelled like lavender and something older, memories, maybe. On the far shelf, I found a box marked in her handwriting. My name. I hadn't seen it before. Inside were small things, notes I'd written her, old report cards, a drawing I barely remembered doing. But there was also a letter, sealed in an envelope, unaddressed. The handwriting was hers. I didn't open it. Not yet. I slipped it into the drawer of the nightstand without knowing why. Later, I found him outside, near the shed. He was fixing the hinge on the door, the same one that had creaked since I was a teenager. I watched from the porch for a moment before stepping down. He glanced up as I approached but didn't say anything. I stood beside him, watching the way his hands moved. Strong, careful, familiar. After a while, he handed me a small container of nails and gestured for me to hold it steady. We worked like that for a while, passing tools back and forth, the silence between us easy again. At one point, he paused, resting his hand against the side of the shed, and looked at me. You were always the brave one, he said. I wasn't sure what to say to that. I didn't feel brave. I felt exposed, uncertain, like I was walking a line I didn't fully understand. I asked him why he stayed all these years, in this house, with her. He didn't answer right away. Then, because sometimes staying feels like the only choice you're allowed to make. We didn't speak again after that. Not for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, I cooked. He set the table. The rhythm of domesticity was strange but soothing. I used to think shared routines were only for couples, for people who built lives together. But now I wondered if maybe routine was just something that grew when two people allowed space for it. We ate in near silence. I could tell he was tired, but not physically. A kind of quiet exhaustion sat in his posture, in the way he held his fork, in the way he looked at the table more than at me. After dinner, I went to the reading room again. I didn't expect him to follow, but he did. He carried a book this time, an old poetry collection. He handed it to me and sat down across the room, waiting. I opened to a random page and read aloud. The words weren't my own, but they filled the room like they could have been. They spoke of things lost and things found again. Of silence. Of stillness. Of spaces between people that once felt infinite and now felt close enough to touch. When I finished, I closed the book and looked up. He was already watching me. Neither of us moved. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else entirely. Something that lived in the quiet and refused to be named. Eventually, he stood. So did I. We stood facing each other, only a few feet apart. He looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. I didn't either. I stepped to the side, letting him pass. He walked out, slow and steady. I stayed in the room, the book still warm in my hands, and stared into the fireless hearth, where the light had gone out hours ago. The kiss from the night before still echoed in me. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt less like a guest and more like someone who had always belonged. But I also knew, deep down, that belonging could be a dangerous thing when it came this quietly. The next morning came wrapped in the kind of stillness that made everything feel suspended. There was no wind, no rain tapping against the windows, no sound of birds or shifting branches. Just silence. A heavy, waiting kind of quiet. I got dressed without much thought, pulling on a soft cotton dress I hadn't worn in years. It was loose, the hem slightly uneven, but familiar in a way that made me feel anchored. Downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, moving about as though the world hadn't tilted since our last real conversation. The smell of coffee reached me before I even saw him, and for a moment, I just stood at the doorway, observing. He looked tired. Not worn down, but thoughtful. He moved slowly, almost carefully, as though trying not to disturb something invisible in the air. When I walked in, he gave me a small nod and poured me a cup without asking. I murmured a thank you and sat at the table, watching the steam rise in lazy swirls. Neither of us mentioned the day before. The trip to town, the letter I hadn't opened, the conversation near the shed. And most noticeably, the kiss from 2 nights ago. It sat between us, no less real for being unspoken. After breakfast, I wandered through the house, unsure of what I was looking for. My steps took me upstairs again, and without meaning to, I ended up back in the sewing room. The envelope I'd found still rested in the nightstand drawer, untouched. I stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering above it, then closed the drawer again. I wasn't ready. Instead, I opened the closet in the hallway and began sorting through the mess. Old linens, dusty boxes, forgotten board games. It was the kind of clutter that built over years, objects left behind not out of sentimentality but out of habit. My hand brushed over a stack of magazines, then landed on a small, leather-bound notebook. No title. Just worn edges and a faint scent of cedar. Inside were sketches. Mostly flowers. Some landscapes. All done in pencil, all delicate and precise. I recognized the handwriting in the margins, my mother's. I flipped through the pages slowly, and toward the back, I found a few pressed wildflowers, carefully taped down. The drawings grew less tidy there, shakier. And on the very last page, a single sentence in her script, "Not everything you lose is a mistake." I closed the notebook and stood still for a long moment. Back downstairs, I found him in the garage. He was fixing a small stool, one of the legs having come loose. The scent of wood shavings and linseed oil filled the air. I leaned against the doorframe and watched him for a moment before stepping inside. He looked up briefly, gave a small smile, then went back to work. There was something grounding in the simplicity of it, him repairing something broken, methodical and focused. I didn't interrupt. I just sat on the bench nearby and watched. My presence didn't seem to bother him. If anything, it seemed welcome. After a while, he wiped his hands on a cloth and set the stool aside. "Do you remember the summer we built the birdhouse?" he asked without looking at me. I did. I'd been 9. We'd painted it bright yellow and watched the birds come and go for weeks. "You insisted on adding curtains to the windows," he continued. I laughed softly. "They were made from scraps of your old shirt." He nodded. "You were very proud of that." There was something in his voice that made me look up. Not regret. Not longing. Just something quieter. Something real. That afternoon, we took a walk by the lake. The path was muddy from the rain earlier in the week, and we moved slowly, careful not to slip. The water was still, mirroring the overcast sky like a sheet of glass. A few ducks floated near the reeds, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. We sat on the old bench facing the water, the same bench we used to rest on during long walks when I was younger. He leaned back, arms crossed, and I sat with my hands in my lap, eyes on the horizon. "You're different now," he said eventually. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. I'd felt it too. "Not just older," he added. "More certain." I thought about that for a moment. I didn't feel certain. If anything, I felt unsteady, like the ground was constantly shifting beneath me. But maybe that was part of it, maybe I'd finally stopped pretending everything made sense. "I think I just stopped trying to be what everyone else expected," I said. He glanced at me, and his eyes softened. "That takes courage." We sat in silence for a while after that, listening to the lake lap gently against the shore. The breeze picked up, cool and steady, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around me. When we stood to leave, he offered me his arm, not out of formality, not out of necessity, but out of something else I couldn't name. That night, the sky turned the color of ash. The air felt heavier, more humid, the kind that signaled a coming storm. I watched the clouds gather from my bedroom window, the first rumbles of thunder whispering in the distance. My fingers brushed against the glass absent-mindedly, and my thoughts scattered in too many directions at once. Downstairs, the lights flickered once, then held steady. I heard the creak of the stairs as he moved around, maybe getting candles, maybe preparing in case the power went out again. I didn't go to him. Not yet. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the drawer where the envelope waited. I opened it, slowly this time, the paper soft from years of rest. The letter inside wasn't long. She had written it at some point during my college years. It wasn't meant for me. It wasn't even signed. But it was clear she had written it with the intention that someone might read it one day. Someone who needed to understand. "I never knew how to love gently," it began. "Everything I gave was either too much or not enough. He stayed because he was kind, not because I asked him to. I think he saw something in you, something I never understood. Maybe that's why I was always distant. Maybe I was afraid." There was more. Short sentences. Fragments. None of them offered answers, but they shifted something inside me. I folded the letter back into the envelope and set it on the nightstand. When I finally made my way downstairs, the house was quiet again. The fire was lit in the reading room, casting soft shadows along the walls. He was there, seated with a book in his lap, but not reading. Just sitting. I crossed the room slowly, and when I reached the hearth, I turned to face him. We didn't say anything. We kissed. And nothing else happened. But somehow everything had changed. Again. The next morning came without warning. I hadn't noticed myself falling asleep, yet I woke to the dull brightness of a clouded sunrise seeping through the curtains. The air in the room felt dense, as though something had settled there overnight and chosen not to leave. My eyes lingered on the empty chair across from the fireplace, where he had sat hours before, and something about the quiet felt different now. Less peaceful. More expectant. I got out of bed slowly, the muscles in my legs stiff from stillness, not pain. My body had begun to return to itself. The bruises had faded, and my limp was nearly gone. But that wasn't what I noticed. It was everything else. The way my hands hovered too long over clothes. The way my thoughts came in half-formed spirals, each one asking the same thing in a slightly different tone: what happens now? Downstairs, the house was nearly silent. A kettle rattled softly on the stove, and I heard footsteps moving through the hall. I didn't rush to meet him. Instead, I stood at the top of the stairs, listening, like I used to when I was younger, curious but unsure if I belonged in whatever was unfolding below. Eventually I went down and found him in the kitchen, already dressed, sleeves rolled up, wiping down the counter as though it were a ritual. The coffee was brewed. The mugs were placed. He looked at me when I entered but didn't speak. I returned the gesture with a nod and poured myself a cup. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy with shared knowledge. Not just about the kisses. Not just about the quiet ways we had begun orbiting each other. But about the fact that something irreversible had taken place. We sat across from each other again, both of us pretending that the ordinary motions of breakfast were enough to fill the space. I buttered toast without tasting it. He read a newspaper but never turned the page. The radio played softly in the background, some local station with music from decades ago, faded and crackling. Afterward, I wandered to the back porch. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick and gray. The wooden boards beneath my feet felt damp, and I noticed the smell of earth and wet leaves. I sat on the steps, arms resting on my knees, and stared out toward the trees. Somewhere behind them was the lake. Still hidden. Still waiting. He joined me after a while, sitting beside me without a word. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. Our nearness had become a language of its own. I keep thinking about time, I said after several minutes. How it folds. How it brings things back whether you ask for them or not. He didn't respond, but I knew he understood. That afternoon, we drove out to the edge of the property. There was a spot near the woods that I used to love as a child, a small clearing with wildflowers and tall grass where I'd sit for hours pretending I was somewhere else. I hadn't been there in years. We parked near the path and walked slowly, the ground soft beneath our shoes. The forest was quiet. Not eerily so, but gently. Respectfully. The wind moved through the trees in hushed waves. When we reached the clearing, I stopped. The flowers were fewer now, the grass a little more overgrown, but the place still held something sacred. A kind of memory made solid. I used to come here when I was angry, I said. When she yelled. Or when I didn't understand why I felt too much all the time. He looked at me, then at the trees. You always carried more than you let on. We sat in the grass, not caring about damp clothes or dirt on our shoes. He leaned back on his hands, face tilted toward the sky. I hugged my knees to my chest and watched a dragonfly dance over the weeds. I think I always thought that if I came back here, things would make sense, I said. But nothing ever lines up the way it does in your head. No, he said quietly. But sometimes it lines up the way it needs to. We stayed there for a long time, talking about nothing. About recipes we missed. About books we pretended to have read. About the way the lake froze too early last year. It was the kind of conversation that moved without direction, but never felt lost. When we returned to the house, the sky had begun to shift again. The clouds thickened, and the smell of coming rain returned. Inside, I changed into dry clothes and tied my hair back, then found myself standing in the hallway outside his room. The door was open. The room was neat, sparse, familiar. His coat hung on the hook near the dresser. The same coat he'd worn since I was in high school. I stepped inside. Not out of curiosity. Not to pry. Just to be there. I noticed the framed photo on the nightstand, an old one of my mother, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. And beside it, a small wooden box. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what mattered wasn't inside it. He found me there moments later. I turned as he approached, expecting a question. But he didn't ask. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, gaze steady. I used to think I was just passing through this house, I said. Like it belonged to her. To both of you. And I was just a visitor. His voice was soft. It never felt that way to me. I looked at him, unsure of how to carry all the things I wanted to say. So I didn't say them. I nodded once and stepped past him, brushing gently against his arm as I walked out. Later that evening, we both found ourselves in the reading room again. It had become a kind of ritual by now. A quiet return to something unnamed. The fire was already lit. The light danced across the walls, casting long shadows that felt almost comforting. I sat in my usual chair, tucking my legs beneath me. He sat across, hands resting on the arms of his chair, body turned slightly toward me. Neither of us reached for a book. We didn't need the distraction. I think I used to look for answers in this house, I said. As if it could explain the things I didn't have the words for. And now, he asked. Now I think it just holds the questions better than most places. The fire crackled. The wind picked up outside. A single drop of rain tapped against the window, then another. We didn't move. And when the power flickered, then dimmed, then finally went out completely, we sat in the dark with only the firelight between us. We kissed. We spent the night together. And that's all I'll say about that. The morning light came hesitantly, filtered through clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to release more rain. The house felt wrapped in a kind of hush, like it knew something had changed but wasn't sure how to carry it. I lay in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to break the spell that hung in the air. The events of the previous night sat with me quietly, not heavy, not light. Just present. I didn't regret anything. There was no shame, no panic. Only the quiet certainty that something unspoken had shifted into something real. The space between us had disappeared, and now I had to learn how to live with that closeness. I dressed slowly, choosing jeans and a loose flannel shirt I found folded in a drawer. It wasn't mine, and I didn't know who it had belonged to, but I wore it anyway. The sleeves were too long. I rolled them up to my elbows and left the room without checking my reflection. Downstairs, the house was still. I walked through the hallway and into the kitchen. He wasn't there, but the kettle had just finished boiling, and the faint smell of toast lingered. 2 mugs sat on the counter, one half full, still warm. He'd been here recently. I poured the second cup and stepped outside. The air was damp, rich with the scent of soil and pine. The sky was pale, the kind of gray that holds the weight of a long night and still offers peace. I followed the gravel path toward the garden, unsure if I'd find him there. I didn't have to look long. He stood by the shed, leaning slightly against the wall, sleeves rolled up, hands loose at his sides. When he saw me, he nodded but didn't speak. I walked toward him slowly, the mug warming my hands. We didn't talk about the night. We didn't have to. There was no tension, no embarrassment. Just an understanding. A line had been crossed. Not in defiance, not in confusion, but in truth. He took the mug from me with a soft thank you, and we stood in silence for a while, watching the trees sway gently in the wind. The birds had returned to their usual rhythm, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the soft hum of a car passing on the road beyond the trees. Eventually, we walked back to the house. He suggested taking the long way, through the back trail that wound past the lake. I agreed without hesitation. The trail was muddy from the rain, but manageable. We walked side by side, not touching, not rushing. The forest closed in around us softly, the canopy above filtering the pale light into a dull glow that made the leaves shimmer. Every step felt deliberate, every breath more grounded than the last. As we reached the lake, we paused. The surface was still, glass-like, reflecting the sky in a way that made it look endless. He pointed toward the opposite bank. There used to be a dock there, he said. Fell apart about 5 years ago. I remember jumping off it, I replied. Mom hated that. She was always worried about what could go wrong, he said. You never were. I shrugged. Maybe that's why she never understood me. We sat on a fallen log near the shoreline, our shoulders just barely not touching. The silence was comfortable. We listened to the breeze moving through the reeds, the occasional rustle of something small in the underbrush. I didn't feel the need to fill the space with words. Neither did he. I used to come here when I was younger, I said after a while. Not just for the quiet. I think I hoped I'd find something I'd lost. What did you lose? I took a breath, then let it out slowly. I don't know. Maybe just the feeling that I belonged somewhere. You've always belonged, he said quietly. Even when you thought you didn't. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. When we returned to the house, the sky had darkened again. A fresh storm was rolling in from the east. The air was thick, humming with the kind of energy that made the skin on your arms prickle. I helped him bring in the chairs from the porch, then collected the towels we'd hung out to dry. He moved with calm purpose, and I followed his lead without question. Inside, the lights flickered briefly, but stayed on. We both moved to the living room without discussing it, like we were following a script we'd written together without realizing. I lit the fire while he prepared tea. The ritual had become second nature by now. We sat across from each other again, the fire crackling gently between us, casting moving shadows on the walls and ceiling. I read the letter, I said, finally. His eyes met mine, steady, unreadable. She wrote it years ago. I don't think she ever intended to send it. But she left it for me, whether she meant to or not. He didn't ask what it said. He waited. She said she didn't know how to love gently. That maybe she was afraid of how much I reminded her of the things she couldn't control. He nodded, once. She said you stayed because you were kind. I did. And that you saw something in me. Even when I was young. I did. There was no weight in his voice. No implication. Just truth. I looked down at my hands, fingers laced together, thumbs rubbing slowly against each other. Do you think she knew what would happen? Between us? I think she saw it long before we did, he said. I swallowed. That doesn't make it easier. No, he agreed. But it makes it clearer. The storm began in earnest then. Rain against the windows, thunder low in the distance. The fire popped and hissed. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders, suddenly cold despite the warmth. He didn't move. Didn't reach for me. But I could feel his presence in every inch of the room. I should go, I said, though I didn't stand. Maybe. But I don't want to. I know. The rain intensified. The lights dimmed again, then came back. We sat like that for a long time, until the storm passed, until the fire burned low. There were no more questions. Only the understanding that what had happened between us was no longer something we could explain away. It simply was. And now we had to carry it, whatever that meant. The morning after the storm brought with it a strange kind of brightness, overcast, yes, but quiet and clear, the world outside looking freshly washed and slightly more honest. Everything held a dampness that felt familiar, like the house itself had exhaled in the night. I rose slowly, the weight in my body not exhaustion but the residue of decisions made. The kind of heaviness that comes when silence is no longer a shield but something shared. I didn't rush to get dressed. I moved through the motions deliberately, brushing my hair, folding the extra blanket at the foot of the bed, adjusting the small stack of books on the nightstand even though none of them had been opened in days. I wasn't stalling. I was preparing. Downstairs, he wasn't in the kitchen, though the kettle had just clicked off and 2 cups sat side by side, one already filled. There were small signs of his presence, the way the chair had been left pushed out slightly from the table, the newspaper folded neatly but not opened. I poured the 2nd cup and stepped out onto the back porch, expecting to find him in the garden or by the shed. But the yard was empty. The trees swayed gently under a sky that couldn't decide between sunlight and shadow. I sat down on the porch step and waited, sipping the tea that was already growing lukewarm in my hands. My mind didn't drift far. It stayed here, in this place, with these memories that no longer felt like ghosts. He returned not long after, walking up the path from the woods. His steps were unhurried, his face unreadable. When he saw me, he offered a small nod, not unlike the first one he gave me when I arrived all those days ago. But now it held something different beneath it. A recognition. An acknowledgement. I didn't speak until he sat beside me. "I didn't sleep much," I said. "Me neither." We sat in silence for a while, both staring out at the trees as though they might offer answers. They didn't, but their stillness felt like enough. "I kept thinking about what comes next," I continued. As if this, what's been happening, was only ever going to be temporary. He didn't interrupt. "I used to be good at leaving," I said. "At packing a bag and not looking back. But now you're not sure," he finished. "No. I'm not." The rest of the day unfolded in quiet motions. We cleaned the house without discussing it, dusting shelves that hadn't been touched in months, airing out rooms that held memories neither of us spoke aloud. I found a box of old board games in the hallway closet and smiled at the sight of them. He passed me with a stack of blankets for the wash and raised an eyebrow when he saw me holding one of the game boxes. "Do you remember when we used to play this during power outages?" I asked. "I remember you changing the rules every 5 minutes. It made the game more interesting. It made it impossible to win." "Exactly," I said, and for a moment, we both laughed. Not the quiet, restrained kind, but something more open, more real. It settled the room. Later, we sat by the fireplace, though there was no fire this time. Just the idea of one. I had the letter again, the one my mother had written and never sent. I hadn't read it again, but I'd thought about it every day since. Her words felt closer now, more grounded. Like maybe I was starting to understand them in ways I hadn't expected. I placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. "She didn't write it to hurt me," I said. "I know that now. But she wrote it knowing someone might find it." He looked at the letter but didn't reach for it. His gaze shifted to me. "She was never cruel," I said. "But she never made space for anything that didn't fit into her version of what life should be. Including me. She was afraid of being out of control. And I was always a little too unpredictable," I said with a faint smile. "You were free." That word settled between us like a marker. There was something about that conversation that changed the rhythm of the day. We didn't speak much afterward. But the silence didn't feel unfinished. It felt accepted. In the evening, I walked to the lake alone. The path was dry now, the storm from the night before leaving only puddles and the smell of wet pine. I stood near the water's edge for a long time, watching as the sky shifted through soft layers of color, gray to silver, silver to pale blue. The reflection in the water was my own, but not the version of me who had arrived here. That woman had been restless, unsure, frayed at the edges. This woman was still uncertain, but no longer running. She was standing still. Looking back. holding eye contact with her own truth. When I returned to the house, he was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Something simple, rice and vegetables, the kind of meal that didn't need much conversation. I joined him without asking. We worked side by side, handing each other spoons and spices, moving in a rhythm that didn't need planning. We ate at the table without ceremony. No candles. No background music. Just the sound of our forks and the occasional clink of glass on wood. After we cleared the plates, he stood for a moment, then turned to me. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," he began. I waited. "You're right. This was never going to stay in the space we found it. And maybe it shouldn't." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I agreed with. "I don't want to pretend this didn't happen," he said. "But I also don't want it to define you." "It doesn't," I replied. "It's part of something bigger. And I'm still figuring out what that is." He didn't press for more. He only said, "Good." The sun had nearly set when I went upstairs. I didn't close my door all the way. I left it open just enough for the hallway light to spill in. A small, silent gesture of something unfinished, but not unresolved. As I lay in bed, I thought about the seasons. About how the trees outside would soon begin to turn, how the leaves would shift into reds and golds, then fall away entirely. And still, the trees would remain. Changed, but rooted. Maybe I was learning how to do that too. To stay. Not in one place, necessarily. But in one truth. And as I drifted into sleep, I understood something that hadn't occurred to me before. The hardest part was never the crossing of the line. It was what came after. Learning how to carry the weight of it. Quietly. Without losing yourself in the process. The day began without noise. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel comforting, but rather like a held breath. There was no rain, no wind against the windows, no creaking wood or kettle whistle, only the slow, deliberate rhythm of morning finding its shape around me. I woke early, before the light had settled fully into the room, and stayed in bed longer than I should have, eyes open, body still. The events of the past week sat layered in my memory, not chaotic but dense. I didn't feel regret, nor did I feel triumph. What I felt was a hum beneath everything, a presence of something unresolved but acknowledged. I had crossed a line and kept walking. And now I was on the other side, trying to make sense of the ground beneath me. I dressed quickly, not thinking much about what I put on. My movements were mechanical, careful. Downstairs, the house held its usual coolness. The kitchen counter had a familiar cup already waiting. The newspaper, untouched. A small sign of him. But no sound of footsteps, no voices, no doors opening or closing. I poured coffee, held it in both hands, and stood at the sink for a long time, watching a small bird hop between puddles just outside the window. He wasn't in the garden or the shed. Not in the living room, nor in the room with the fireplace where so much had unfolded over the past days. The silence began to shift, turning from peaceful into something that edged toward uncertain. I wasn't afraid, but something in my chest tightened. A new kind of waiting. Eventually, I found him in the hallway. Standing near the front door, a small overnight bag resting at his feet. His posture was straight, his hands loose by his sides, but I could see the weight in his shoulders. "I didn't know you were going anywhere," I said. He looked at me, eyes steady but unreadable. "I didn't either," he replied. "Not until this morning." I didn't speak. I waited, coffee cooling in my hands. "I need space," he continued. "Just for a day or two. I need to think clearly, and I'm not sure I can do that here." The words didn't hurt the way I expected. They landed with a soft finality, not rejection but pause. A necessary distance. I nodded once, slowly. Where will you go? Just the cabin near the highway. By the stream. I won't be far. There was a long silence between us. Then he picked up the bag, opened the door, and hesitated on the threshold. I'll call you, he said. And then he left. The sound of the door closing echoed longer than it should have. I stood there for a moment, staring at the space he'd just occupied, and then turned back toward the kitchen. The coffee had gone cold. I dumped it down the sink and set the cup aside. The house felt different now. Not empty, but suspended. As if time had slowed down to allow me room to think. I wandered through each room without purpose, touching things I hadn't noticed in years. The edge of a bookshelf. A stack of folded blankets. The small crack in the window frame upstairs that used to whistle when the wind hit it right. I ended up in my mother's old room. The bed was made perfectly, her way of pretending control over things that could never be fully managed. On the dresser were a few framed photographs, me as a child, one of her with friends, one of her wedding day. Him, smiling beside her, young and unaware of everything that would come after. I sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the letter again. The one I'd read but hadn't put away. Her words now seemed less like confession and more like warning. Or maybe a quiet surrender. I folded it slowly, carefully, and slipped it into the drawer beside her hairbrush and a few old receipts. By the afternoon, I felt restless. I walked to the lake, stopping briefly at the clearing where the flowers were already beginning to wilt at the edges. The season was turning. It always did, even when you weren't paying attention. At the lake, I sat on the edge of the dock. The boards were soft beneath me, damp from recent rain, but I didn't care. My feet dangled just above the water, and I watched the wind ripple the surface in gentle waves. I thought about what had brought me here. The injury, the recovery, the suggestion to rest. But it hadn't been about rest. Not really. It had been about returning. About facing something I had left behind, something I didn't realize had been sitting inside me this whole time. Waiting. I stayed by the lake until the sun lowered and the sky turned a dusty blue. Then I walked back, slowly, hands in my pockets, each step deliberate. When I returned to the house, the lights were still off. The air felt unchanged, settled. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I wasn't hungry. I sat in the reading room, not to read, but just to sit. The fire was out. I didn't bother lighting it. The silence didn't feel cold. It felt honest. I stared at the empty chair across from me and imagined him there. Not in a romantic way. Not with longing or fantasy. Just presence. A person I had known for so long in one shape, who had slowly become something else. I had no illusions about the situation. What we shared wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't simple either. And maybe that was the hardest part, accepting that truth could exist without being tidy. That sometimes it wasn't about right or wrong, but about understanding what had been hiding beneath the surface for years and finally choosing to stop pretending. I went to bed early, the house holding its quiet. I left the window open slightly, letting in the breeze and the distant sound of insects waking up for the night. Lying there, I didn't feel fear or sadness. Just the weight of what comes after clarity. Space. Not absence. Not abandonment. Just space. A necessary breath between two moments that could no longer be one. The next morning arrived slowly, pressing itself against the edges of my sleep like fog rolling over the hills. I woke not to sound, but to stillness, the kind that doesn't announce itself, only settles. The house was colder than usual, though I wasn't sure if it was the air or something internal. I stayed beneath the covers for a long time, eyes open, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. I didn't know if he would return that day. He hadn't said exactly how long he'd be gone, only that he needed space. And I hadn't asked for more. But time stretches differently in the absence of someone who once filled every quiet space with unspoken presence. The rooms of the house echoed differently now. Even my own footsteps felt louder. Eventually I rose, wrapped myself in a thick sweater, and moved through the house with the quiet purpose of someone trying to stay busy. I cleaned out a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. I wiped down the windows. I dusted the tops of shelves where cobwebs had formed undisturbed. Each task gave me just enough motion to avoid thinking too deeply. But thought has a way of creeping in, no matter how much you try to outrun it. By midday, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the untouched letter on the windowsill. It had been moved from my nightstand, then to the coffee table, then here, each time unintentionally, as if it belonged nowhere and yet refused to disappear. I picked it up again and unfolded it slowly. I had read it before, but this time I read it aloud. Her handwriting, once so familiar, felt more distant now. The words, still sharp, still uncertain, but less heavy. They were hers, yes, but I no longer felt owned by them. They belonged to a different time, a different woman. I folded it once more and, this time, placed it in a drawer in the hallway. Not hidden. Not displayed. Just put away. I spent the early afternoon walking the perimeter of the property. The wind had picked up, and the trees moved like breath. I found myself back at the clearing, the one near the edge of the woods where the flowers had started to thin. I sat on the low stone where I used to perch as a girl, knees pulled to my chest, head tilted toward the sky. There were no revelations. No sudden clarity or answers. Just the faint awareness that I had come full circle. Not in the sense of completion, but in the way a season ends only to begin again. I returned home in the late afternoon, colder than expected, fingers stiff, nose flushed from the wind. I made tea and curled into the reading room chair, the one by the window that caught the last light of day. I didn't start a fire. The silence didn't need warmth. It was enough just to sit and watch the sun fade through bare branches. I didn't hear the car when it arrived. I didn't notice the sound of the front door opening or the quiet footfall in the hallway. I only became aware of him when he stepped into the room, the edge of his coat still dusted with the day's wind, his face tired, but certain. I didn't speak. Neither did he. He crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair across from mine. Not too close. Not withdrawn. Just present. The silence between us was thick, but no longer uncomfortable. It was full, held together by the weight of everything we hadn't said and everything we didn't need to. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands folded. I needed to remember who I was before all of this, he said quietly. Not because I wanted to undo anything, but because I had forgotten. I listened. Every word landed without resistance. And I realized something while I was gone, he continued. I wasn't trying to forget what happened here. I was trying to decide if I had the right to carry it with me. He paused, then looked at me, eyes steady. I do. Still, I didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the small table between us and leaned back in his chair. I wrote this while I was there, he said. You can read it later. Or not. I just needed you to have it. I didn't move toward the paper. I wasn't ready. But I appreciated the offering, the shape of his thought made visible. Outside, the last light was beginning to fade. The sky had turned a dusky blue, and the first hints of stars were pushing through the thinning clouds. The world was quiet again. Not like before. Not empty. But balanced. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I just want you to know that what happened, what we became, it mattered to me. And it wasn't a mistake. His voice was soft, but the words were anchored. I nodded slowly, fingers tightening around my tea. It mattered to me too. That was all. We didn't stretch it into something more than it needed to be. After a while, he stood. I'll be upstairs if you need anything. I nodded again. He left the room quietly, and I was alone once more. But it didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like the space between one breath and the next. When I finally unfolded the note he left, it wasn't long. Just a few lines written in his familiar hand. I didn't expect any of this. I didn't plan it. But you brought something back I thought I had lost. And even if you decide to leave tomorrow, I will carry that with me. Always. I folded it again and placed it on the windowsill beside the empty cup. That night, I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the moon climb its way over the trees. The sky was clear. The air still. There were no more decisions to make. Only the quiet knowing that we had both been changed. Not ruined. Not broken. Just altered. Tomorrow, I would leave. Or I wouldn't. But whatever I chose, I would carry the truth of what had happened here. And I would not be ashamed.